I'm Alexei Michailowsky from York University in Toronto, Canada. In this paper, I will be speaking about Canadian pop singer Patsy Gallant, specifically about how she explored a variety of vocal and expressive techniques and possibilities to continually and strategically change her musical persona between 1972 and 1984. In that period, she released a total of 12 albums, 7 in English and 5 in French, reaching superstar status in Canada and achieving worldwide success, particularly as a disco music singer between 1976 and 1978. Commercial trends, as well as the singer's own passions and wishes to express what happened in her life and her vision of the world around her, led to the development of four main expressions for her stage character. They feature the same core aspects, highlighting the fact that Gallant always retained a lot of herself in her musical persona. Those major expressions were never abandoned. They kept coming and going. Sometimes they coexisted in a same album. All of this leads to the idea of a single fluid musical persona instead of multiple independent personas. One of the most important elements that we can use to differentiate each expression of Patsy Gallant's musical persona is her voice. A virtuosic vocalist, she made use of varied vocal techniques to sound different on different recordings. Exploring this feature should be an important way towards understanding her music and herself as an artist, as well as the environment where she developed her career. Another element that needs to be considered for exploring Patsy Gallant's music is her bilingualism. Her New Brunswick origin made her speak her own version of Franglish. So, she can naturally mix words, sounds, and verses. How and why Patsy Gallant explored her vocal resources to construct and reconstruct her fluid musical persona on her recordings. I listened to her full discography between 1970 and 1984 and analyzed it under different perspectives to trace the determinant features on her singing for distinguishing a specific persona. Sometimes I would just listen and interpret, making comparisons with other recordings whenever applicable. Whenever I needed to make measurements or deal with numbers, I ran the digitized audio through audio analysis tools such as Sonic Visualizer. I also referenced on scholar literature about the essentials of singing and about using the voice to forge a character's identity. I also conducted an extensive search for media articles and recordings of old radio and TV shows featuring Patsy Gallant. Finally, I interviewed Gallant in 2 occasions and had the opportunity of discussing her singing with her in multiple informal conversations and telephone calls. The few authors who write about Canadian pop music usually highlight a short period of Gallant's career when she became perhaps the most successful disco music singer in Canada. Benoit L'Herbier, writing about popular music in Quebec, mentions the first years of Gallant's recording career. He includes her in a group of inoffensive artists who basically produced commercial pop music, described as la quétaine, a Quebec French vernacular term meaning kitschy. Canadian contributions to disco music have not been sufficiently approached by the literature so far. Authors only tend to pay attention to those artists who successfully managed to break into the market of the United States or achieve exceptional worldwide success. Also, all disco music authors who discuss disco music and culture in the 70s overlook the fact that Canada was an important dance music production and consumption center during the 70s and early 80s. But Will Straw, a professor from McGill University, has been a leading voice in the process of recognizing Montreal as an important disco music hub in the late 70s and early 80s. The scholar acknowledges the existence of a strong dance scene and a very active music production scene in the city in a 2014 article for the Red Bull Music Academy website. Literature about how popular artists develop different music personas is also relatively scarce as we speak. Lucy O'Brien studies women in popular music and discusses how Madonna continuously transformed her musical persona and managed it over her career to explore different topics such as lesbianism, sin, religion, and topics on femaleness and femininity, imposing herself as a pop icon. Elizabeth Amisu explores every facet of Michael Jackson's life and art, as well as his multiple personas in an effort to understand the political and ideological questions that surrounded him, including sexuality, racism, gender, and class. And Isabelle Stagner-Petit-Jean explores how Jackson approached his vocal aspects to forge his artistic identity and personality over his career. This study is divided in three parts. The first one discusses some important general aspects of Patsy Gallant's voice and singing, which have remained constant all over her career and may be shared by all her personas without distinction. In the second one, each one of Patsy Gallant's personas is presented and the vocal elements which compose their specific identities are discussed in detail. The third part features conclusions. In this section, I will discuss the general aspects of Patsy Gallant's voice and singing. They can be observed essentially in all expressions of her musical persona between 1972 and 1984. By listening to Patsy Gallant's discography, we can distinguish two basic voices that she established over the years by manipulating her timbre. One is her nasal voice, which appears frequently when she sings funk, rock, and up-tempo disco music, or whenever she needs to reach very high notes. The other is her velvet voice. Some traces of it can be found on some of her earlier recordings, but in 1976, a sexier repertoire demanded a new voice. Gallant frequently used that voice for seducing, moaning, and whispering. Patsy Gallant is a coloratura soprano and possesses a very wide vocal extension. The lowest note that she can sing is an E-flat 3, and she is capable of reaching at least an F7. Yeah. This vocal extension allows Gallant to trick her listeners. Sometimes she will sing songs in different regions of her voice without feeling uncomfortable. Patsy Gallant's chest register also has a very wide extension, making it particularly difficult to precise the location of her primary register transition, or PRT, the point where the larynx naturally wants to shift from one primary register to the other. The transition between the chest voice and the head voice is creatively explored by yodelers, for example. In Gallant's case, she very often switches to head voice as an expressive choice rather than because of a physical need. She can sing a few notes with her head voice in a song and then sing even higher notes with her chest voice in another song. In her discography, the only possible reference for a PRT would be the Upstairs Vocalist in the 1974 track Power. Patsy Gallant's singing naturally expresses femininity and strength, allowing her to be portrayed occasionally as a superheroine. This image has been more evidenced in the albums Power, 1974, and Take Another Look, 1984. With this perspective in mind, some of her performances in the studio and particularly on stage have been constructed in a way where there is normally a climax moment in the final part. Generally, it consists on Gallant singing out loud hi-hat notes. Another interesting aspect is that aging did not affect Patsy Gallant's voice as much as expected in female singers. At the age of 70 years old, she is still capable of singing the songs she recorded at 25 in the same original keys whenever she feels the need of transposing a song down. It is never by more than one tone. The superheroine did not lose her superpowers. Patsy Gallant implemented some recurrent vocal fingerprints over her career. One of the most detectable are her breathy whispers. Initially, she used them more in her French-language albums, but eventually brought them to her Anglophone recordings as well. The second one is a very particular way of pronouncing the sound with some nose resonance and a smaller round mouth opening. The third one appears exclusively when she's singing in French, the gargling R. It is not a sound commonly used in spoken Paris French or Montreal French, but some singers exaggerate the R as an aesthetic option. And now, I will discuss each one of the major expressions of Patsy Gallant's musical persona, highlighting their main vocal elements. From 1972 to the second semester of 1975, the Mighty Patsy, or Super Patsy, was the predominant expression of her persona. She emerged with the release of Gallant's first two albums for CBS, Upon My Own in English, Tout va trop vite in French. She was a young, versatile, and virtuosic singer, described as a power talent. The songs she recorded allowed her to explore a wide vocal extension, covering an average of 2 octaves, as well as a notable dynamics contrast, where she could start singing in a soft, introspective way and then switch to shouting at one specific point. In other moments, she would shout from the top and show her lungs were really strong. The most notable stylistic feature of the Mighty Patsy's singing is a heavy use of the melisma, which is a group of multiple notes sung to a single syllable. Also known as vocal run or vocal riff, it is very commonly used on African American music. Very influenced by female singers whose vocal identities included a significant use of melismas, like Ella Fitzgerald and Aretha Franklin, Patsy Gallant brought melismas to many of her songs during her Mighty Patsy days. On December 2, 1975, Patsy Gallant appeared on the Radio-Canada show, Vedette en Direct. Most of her set featured disco music, a genre she had been recording since 1973, when she was the first artist ever to record disco in French, with a song named Dia do Dum. But she was invested in disco more intensively with the release of a single featuring a version of Gilles Vigneault's 1964 song Mon Pays. That TV show completed Gallant's transition from the Mighty Patsy to the Canadian disco queen. A very sexy, sparkling, bubbly diva who was ready to party all night long, the Canadian disco queen represented a period of Gallant's biggest commercial success, with songs like Sugar Daddy and particularly From New York to LA, the English language version of Mon Pays. She also played with her voice, like in the 1978 track Slow Down, where she sang a downwards portamento to introduce a synthesizer solo. The Canadian disco queen was a superheroine as well. She could perform intense dance routines on stiletto heels. She sounded as feminine, sensual, and suggestive as she could ever sound. Occasionally, she openly suggests sexual pleasure with her vocals, adopting a repertoire of moaning, whispering, groaning, and hollering without words. And with the 1976 albums Are You Ready for Love and Besoin d'Amour, she consolidated her two major vocal timbres, the nasal voice and a new velvet voice for ballads and romantic moments. As the Canadian disco queen, Patsy Gallant was no longer mainly focused on showing off her superior vocal skills. The use of exuberant melismas was significantly balanced in this period. She adopted a one-note per syllable perspective, making it much easier for listeners to understand the lyrics. In 1980, attempting to present herself as a more serious artist, Patsy Gallant emerged as Sweet Lady Patsy. This expression of her musical persona had been around since the beginning of her recording career, but became predominant for her 1981 albums, Stranger in the Mirror and Amoureuse. Although Sweet Lady Patsy retained a good portion of the Canadian disco queen's sexiness, she sounds rather romantic and delicate. She waits for her lover and sometimes sings sad, nostalgic songs. Focused on interpretations, she adjusts the timbre of her voice to express different states of spirit. Her vocals reflect confidence and sophistication. The absolute majority of her singing is syllabic, with the exception of sparse and short ornaments. With no intention of exploring her technical limits or showing off her skills, she favors a clear and clean delivery without too much vibrato. She almost never resorts to moaning and avoids big dynamics contrasts in her performances. By the end of 1983, Patsy Gallant emerged with a new song, Hit the Streets Tonight, where she introduced the high-tech girl to her audience. Unlike all her other musical persona expressions, the high-tech girl seems to be a part of a specific concept, which is presented all over side A of her 1984 album Take Another Look. Presented in the first track as a cyborg heroine created in a lab, the high-tech girl is a night creature who hunts for her man. Powered by love, she is very intelligent and extremely sexy. Another element that accentuates her cyborg nature is the adoption of digital effects. On High Tech Girl, the song which introduces the persona and the story, Gallant's vocals are processed with the help of a stereo delay machine. The intention does not seem to be altering the timbre of her voice, but actually creating a virtual environment from which the High Tech Girl originates. In the arrangements, particularly the synthesizers execute some parts with a clear semiotic function. The sequence fast arpeggios in the introductions and endings, or even all through a song, represent fast sequenced movements, as if the high-tech girl came from an early video game. A loop of continuous non-diegetic music indicates an engine, a machine working while she hits the city in search of her lover. Furthermore, Gallant's voice was used to develop a semiotic element on Hit the Streets Tonight. She inserts some rhythmically organized, quick and percussive explosions of breath, coupled with guttural sounds in the chorus. The breathing may represent the high-tech girl's hard physical effort, cruising the streets, or her sexual drive towards her man. Gallant singing as the high-tech girl is completely syllabic, without ornaments or melismas. To emphasize the character's cyborg nature, it is also rather mechanic. She tends to repeat choruses without variations or improvisations. About the timbre and the dynamics of her vocals, she favors her nasal voice on Take Another Look and sings with high intensity all over the tracks. The study of Patsy Gallant's discography between 1972 and 1984 reveals an exceptionally versatile and tireless pop music artist. Starting her career from French Canada has given her opportunities to explore her creative drive under unique perspectives and create an original blend that allowed her to become a complete Canadian artist who could speak to Francophone and Anglophone audiences, as well as try her hand in the international market. The Canadian record industry of the 70s and early 80s allowed her to show proficiency in multiple music genres. She was able to respond to the rapidly changing trends in the industry, according to market opportunities as well as to her own passions and wishes. But her stage persona always had something to do with the real Patricia Gallant. As a consequence, she developed a fluid musical persona that has retained the same core characteristics as much as possible. It had four major expressions. The Mighty Patsy was predominant between 1972 and 1975. The Canadian Disco Queen between 1975 and 1980. Sweet Lady Patsy between 1980 and 1982. And the High Tech Girl between 1983 and 1985. Always exploring her physical and expressive limits, Gallant was able to tweak and adjust her vast vocal resources to different circumstances and forge a specific identity for each one of her persona expressions by reconfiguring parameters such as timbre, pitch, and dynamics. Some recurrent aspects of her singing became true fingerprints, such as her breathy whispers and her peculiar woo sound. She also investigated her easy transit between the two solitudes of Canada to bring French flavors to her singing in English or add verses or full strophes in English to a song in French whenever she felt appropriate. Studying how Patsy Gallant explored a variety of vocal parameters and techniques navigating wings of change, defying power structures, and always following her heart to develop her different musical personas is one good perspective to discover a multifaceted Canadian human being and artist who has yet to be discovered in full by Canada and by the world.